Okay, welcome to the conversation on June 12, 2014. The topic is relational leading, expanding capacity through collaborative practices. Our guests are Sheila McNamee and Kristin Bodiford. The conversation is sponsored by the Taos Institute's online master's program in relational leading. I'm your host, Saliha Bava. I'm a full-time faculty at Mercy College and faculty in the Relational Leading program. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers today, who are my friends and colleagues, Sheila McNamee and Kristin Bodiford. Kristin is a core faculty in the MSc Relational Leading program, and she is a visiting assistant professor at Dominican University Graduate School of Social Work. She's also the principal of Community Strengths. Welcome, Kristin. Sheila is the co-founder and board member of Taos Institute. She's also a professor of communication at the University of New Hampshire and professor of organizational culture in the School of Humanities at Tilburg University. Welcome, Sheila. So Sheila, let's start with you.
Okay, thank you, and welcome everyone. Thanks for being present, part of this series. I'm sure many of you have been following the other webinars that have been very exciting and interesting as well. So we want to take up the issue of collaborative practice as a form of relational leading, and start by saying that really as we see organizational life now, it really requires a new form of practice because organizational life is complex, engaged with multiple factors and quite diverse. Just as an illustration, you know, we have various cultural, social, racial, socioeconomic, gender worldviews. We also have, and some of you have already posted questions, this attempt to fit a collaborative way of working in an organization within an organizational structure that may already be quite hierarchical. So there's a lot of diversity and multiplicity and complexity that we have to deal with as we think about collaborative practice and as a form of relational leading. Kristin, you want to say a little something more about that?
Well, thank you, Sheila, for starting us off with this, and hello, everyone. And earlier when we were talking about examples of this, and one of the things that struck me is when you were talking about an organizational example of how organizations are no longer situated in one place. So if we look at location as one factor that's contributing to this organizational context. So organizations may be local, regional, national, or international, but people are often very spread out geographically. People are working from their home offices, different branch offices. Some people may be working in offices within the city. So this one ingredient, location, really introduces this concept of complexity that you were talking about. How do we communicate? How do we coordinate our work together? The other ingredient you were talking about is multiplicity. So each location may have its own way of doing things. And then with diversity, different forms of practice and local cultures make partner locations different. So the question or challenge we have then is how to respect the differences brought about by the complexity and multiplicity and diversity, and become curious about how we might collaborate and coordinate our efforts together in a way that expands capacity.
Yeah, right. So do you want to move to, thank you. How do we expand capacity through collaborative practice? One thing before I talk through these notions that I want to point out is that, well, two things actually. One is that what we're talking about is not a set of techniques or a hard and true method that will produce the collaborative work environment. It's really the way I think we see it as a set of resources for action that are quite flexible and fluid, that as we talk through these notions, each one of us might think in a particular moment, in a particular organizational situation, we might think about how to put into practice these resources in a very particular way, so that the how, the what we do, could take multiple forms. It may never look the same, but the idea, the resources of, for example, coordinating multiplicity becomes a really valuable resource. There was something else I was going to say, and I can't remember right now. But anyway, it'll come back to me. So let's talk through some of these resources. One that I think is really important is this idea of coordinating multiplicity. Oftentimes when we confront difference and diversity and multiplicity in any context, the first attempt is to adjudicate between the differences, that is, to decide which is right, which is wrong, which is better, which is worse. Or the alternative is often to try to bring together the differences in some kind of consensus process. So you have just the little bit of overlap where everyone can agree, and all the stuff that people usually are most passionate about gets pushed to the margins. What we are suggesting here is, rather than consensus, rather than trying to discern which is right, wrong, better, best, etc., to try to keep the conversation going in terms of opening the possibility for how these different views might come to appreciate one another. Not necessarily to agree, but to kind of become curious about so many multiple ways of looking at a situation, to see that as a resource rather than as a deficit. And I think, you know, in many of our own work contexts and everyday contexts and community contexts, we see that there's a way of approaching difference by appreciating the multiple lenses that difference allows us. Another resource, engaging in reflexive inquiry. I know that this topic was discussed in the last webinar by Joe Raylan and Harleen Anderson, and you know, reflexive inquiry is, I think, vitally important to what we do in a relational, from a relational perspective. So the antithesis of reflexive inquiry would be certainty, to act with certainty. And as professionals, culturally, we are trained to be certain. That's the mark of a good professional, is to know exactly what needs to be done. So this is somewhat counterintuitive for people to step into the space where, as a professional, as someone who is engaged in some sort of relational leading process, to pause and to engage in that inner dialogue. Are there other ways I could think of this? Are there other things we could be doing? Might I think about the other's actions in different terms, not necessarily in the terms I'm currently thinking of them? That's a form of reflexive inquiry that is focused on self-reflexivity, but there's also a notion of relational reflexivity where we might explicitly comment on the process with those with whom we're working. You know, we could ask a question: is this way of doing things working for all of us? Are you hoping that there would be different ways that we could do things? Are there different questions you were hoping we would be engaging in here? How are we doing? So kind of that allowing yourself and those with whom you're working to continually be reflecting on what is happening here, and, you know, how are we part of creating what this outcome is. Another resource is to avoid abstraction, and what I mean by that is, you know, oftentimes in our professional lives as well as in our personal lives, we have very clear ideas of how things should be. This is right and this is wrong. This is good and this is bad. But when we say those things, when we identify something as good or bad or right or wrong, we're really speaking in these abstract terms, as opposed to inviting the story, which would, if I could tell you how I've come to think of something as a good form of practice or a good way of being in the world or in the organization, if I tell you my story, you understand how I've come to that abstract position that this is good or right. But without the story, it just becomes more of a dominating view that this is just the way things are done. So if in order to expand our capacity in organizations, the more we can invite the stories of participants and all stakeholders, the more we invite them into collaborative practice with us. Prioritizing understanding, not agreement, I think is central. We have a long history of taking complexity, multiplicity, and diversity, as I mentioned, and trying to figure out how to make that all fit into one basket, make all these different views be the same or be similar. Could we pause, I think, this focus and this need to come to agreement? I mean, of course, in our lives, agreement, and in our organizations, agreement is necessary. But could we just bracket it for the moment and prioritize understanding each other first before we prioritize agreement? So can I come to understand the way everybody in the organization is trying to make sense out of this current situation? How are we working, rather than focus on fitting them all into the same ball? Okay, so understanding, I think that's actually so incredibly important to think about understanding as primary. In imagining the future, I find this really interesting, and of course we have a lot of background with appreciative inquiry, imagining the future, and there are many other ways of working that put a premium on future-oriented conversation. But I just wanted to point out that you know, oftentimes when we're problem solving in organizations, we go backwards. We ask, you know, when did the problem begin, and what did we try to do to solve it, and why did that fail, and what can we do now? And there's nothing wrong with that kind of an analysis. In fact, it can often be quite helpful. But at the same time, as we ask those sorts of questions, we are inviting ourselves and others into a causal logic, one that says whatever happened at this point is the cause of what's happening now. And again, that's one way of talking about things. But when we ask people to imagine the future, what would be ideal? What would be the best case scenario of how we could be as an organization, or how we could solve this problem, or how we could roll out this new initiative? When we talk about the future hasn't happened yet. And so, of course, we are inviting people into a moment of co-construction that's generative. So I think those future-oriented conversations, sometimes they're referred to as conversations of the ideal. What would the ideal situation be? I think they can be quite generative and really expand our capacity. Using the familiar and unfamiliar domains is is a favorite of mine, because you know, when we all think back to our own training, when we're training to become the professionals we've become, or if we still are in training, you often think of that the ultimate position that you will hold as, you know, it's a bit unattainable. It's not familiar to you. You're going to become a manager. You're going to become a CEO of a company. You're going to become a university professor, whatever it is. And you adorn, you know, some resources for action that are just not at all familiar to you. You're trying to fit yourself. It's like trying to fit into some new clothes that are the wrong size or something. And I think what we need to do is give ourselves and those we work with the liberty to take their own conversational resources, the familiar ways of talking and acting, and put them into play in new ways, in unfamiliar contexts. So a way of talking with your family, with your colleagues, with your friends doesn't necessarily have to be inappropriate to a way of talking and being and acting as a manager. That we need to remember that we have multiple voices, and we have those multiple voices become multiple resources. And often those very familiar resources can be the most generative in the present moment, instead of squelching them because we think we need to step into a very particular kind of discourse in a work context. Avoiding plans and encouraging preparing. That I know that sounds antithetical, and of course I would say that planning is good, but only if you're willing to throw your plan away. And that's why I say encourage preparing and avoid plans, because oftentimes if we have a plan, you know, we just need to stick to it. But if we prepare by planning with the notion that no plan can be perfect ahead of time. So if we want to expand our capacity, if we want to invite people into collaborative practice with us, we need to have an idea, but be willing to shift and change, be willing to improvise at any moment and at every moment. And to be okay with that, that not sticking to a plan is actually quite a good thing, because it means we're being relationally sensitive to the moment, to the interactive moment, to what's happening, to what's going on around us, to what people are talking about. And finally, creating the space is something that is important, and I think it is a question that many of us have. You know, how do we create the space in an organization, in a community, in a group, that allows for this kind of collaboration, allows for this form of relational leading? And I think that there's no one way, of course, but I think being attentive to the humanness of our coordinations with one another, to bring some of that humanness into these other environments. You know, you can think of the great things that the really successful companies now like Apple and Google do. You know, they have ping pong tables in the meeting rooms so that people can be playing ping pong while they're making decisions and things like that. So just, you know, to take some time to actually think about how do we both physically and just in every general sense create this sense that it's okay for us to have differences, and it's okay for us to try to talk through those differences and try to, you know, find a way to coordinate and negotiate our actions together. Kristin, would you like to give some elaborations on these? You're muted.
Yes, actually, and there's been a lot of questions and a lot. Oh, am I still muted?
No, you're okay now. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good, good. Yes, and there's actually been some really nice dialogue in the chat too that I wanted to bring into our conversation, and I have a whole page of notes from when you were talking about some questions that I had and illustrations. One of the things that we'll do in this conversation that you and I had planned is actually share some stories. So attending to the resource of avoiding abstraction and inviting stories, we're going to share some of our stories, and then people have also asked for some specific stories. So can I ask you for an example from one of the questions in the chat?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So Sue Minton would like an example of using the familiar and unfamiliar domains. And would you like to give a story or an example?
Well, I have a favorite story that is actually incriminating to myself. So, but I'll try to make it a short story. When I finished my PhD, I did my PhD research on the process of therapy, and afterwards, a colleague invited me to train to become a family therapist, because he said that he could tell that that was really what my interest was. And he called my bluff. I was interested in that. So the very first meeting of this training session, they gave me a family, which was, I'll spare the details, but it was a very complex family situation. And we prepared, you know, what kind of questions to ask and so forth ahead of time. And in those days, the therapist would be in the room and the team and the supervisor would be behind a one-way mirror. So anyway, I sat with the family and I rushed through all the things that we had talked about, the questions. Asked a question, didn't listen to an answer. Asked another question, didn't listen to an answer. Asked a question, you know, I was the worst therapist that could ever be. And eventually my supervisor called me out of the room, and he had known what I had done my PhD research on. So he said, "What did you do your PhD research on?" And I said, "You know what I did it on. This is no time to talk about that. Help me in this room." And we went back and forth, and finally I said, you know, I interviewed families and therapists about the process. And he said, "Did you feel comfortable doing that?" And I said, "Of course I did." And he said, "Well, then go back in that room and act like a researcher." So that's my example of using the familiar in an unfamiliar domain. It was being a therapist was not familiar to me. Being a researcher was very familiar. As I went back into that room and with my researcher hat on and had a very generative conversation with that family. So that's my example.
I love that. You know, that also reminds me of, so you're talking about like kind of identity and roles and things of that sort too, and the blending of that. And I also think about just different resources that we are used to using that we can use in new domains. Appreciative inquiry is one that for some reason, sometimes I completely forget some of the principles and skills and practices with appreciative inquiry, and people will say, why don't you do an appreciative interview? And I'll say, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah.
But this whole process of also engaging in curiosity is something that I found I have translated into many different domains. And so taking that familiar position of curiosity into domains, especially as you were talking about the professional expertise, where we're supposed to be representing that we are experts and professionals in a particular process, and being able to shift that to a stance of curiosity has always been a useful resource for me, thinking about that. The other question that came in was from, I think from Annette, about engaging, or it was more of a reflection about engaging in reflexive inquiry in that self-inner dialogue, and how challenging that can be, even under, especially under situations of stress. So Annette, I really appreciate you sharing that, and I was reminded of the work that I'm doing around trauma-informed practice, and how we were creating safety plans as an example of how little practices that we can do in moments that when we're triggered, so that we can take care of our own and other safety, and that ability to be in a space and create a space relationally and for ourselves that we can take that pause and be in that place of reflexive inquiry. And it takes so much practice sometimes. And if we're in a heated conversation in an organizational environment, how do we create a space that allows for that reflexive inquiry to happen? Do you have any thoughts or any stories that you can share about ways that organizations or teams have been able to really incorporate that space for reflexive inquiry?
Yeah. I think it is extremely difficult, but there are two things I think that are very helpful. One is to remember that pausing is really okay, and in fact can be really a great thing. And so oftentimes, you know, I have lots of personal examples of saying in the heat of something, just saying, you know what, could we just separate for 10 minutes, for half an hour, for a day, whatever seems appropriate, you know, and come back to this. I just want to collect myself, because I don't feel like this conversation will transpire in a generative way for us if we continue like this. So sometimes to just name it, you know, to name what you're doing and ask for that opportunity to pause. Other times, I might just say, wow, that's really interesting what you've said. Just give me a minute. I just need to like think about that. So you can sit with the person, you can still be in that moment, but make public that you don't want to respond too quickly, that you really are thinking about it. And that's actually, I think that oftentimes in my experience changes the tenor of what's happening, because that's a very respectful move to do in relation to the other, you know, to say, I really want to think carefully about what you've just said, or about what's going on here. Just give me a couple minutes. Okay. And then I think the other way of thinking about this is that the more you do things like that, the more common it becomes. So it becomes part of your natural repertoire. And you don't need to, you know, constantly be saying, oh my God, I responded too quickly, you know, because you sort of slow yourself down over time. And also, particularly in those heated moments that become really critical, you begin to realize the minute you feel the heat that this is when you need to slow down, so that it signals that for yourself. And you know, as they say, practice makes perfect. So
yes. I was just reminded of the stories that we've shared about parenting as well, where we may have not engaged in reflexive inquiry in the moment as much as we'd like to.
No.
And the ability to come back and say, can we start over again?
Yeah, exactly.
And just the graciousness of human beings to be able to do that. I just think it's a really beautiful thing.
Well, and also I think let me just embellish that a little bit further, because you know, it is okay to say, wow, I'm really sorry that I'm sorry I said that. You know, that's not going to help us move forward at all. So there is that ability, you know, to admit that everything we do isn't perfect, and to, you know, I love that. Can we start this over again? This, you know, it's almost like, you know, take two, you know, cut. Don't like the way this film is unrolling, so.
Great. So I think just two more before we move on to some stories that illustrate some of these resources. I did want to, Jean, you had mentioned, how do I deal with group members that expect answers from me as a leader? And, you know, I've dealt with this so much working with systems change work, that when we bring community together to be an inquiry and really share the resources and strengths that different community organizations have around a particular issue, at times communities and organizations and people may say, just tell us what to do. We need to know what to do. And I was reminded about that when you were talking about the relational reflexive inquiry as well. Like, is this way working for you? What else do we need? I think two of the resources, kind of, maybe three, maybe more than that, but three of the resources I'll point out that kind of remind me of this aspect of attending to what the group needs in order to move forward. So one was the relational reflexive inquiry. You know, how is this working for you? What else do we need in order to move forward? And it may be that in some cases people need to hear. You and I have talked about that in terms of in the academic world, and as we're teaching, that there are times that our professional expertise and knowledge is a resource for our collaborative learning. And so being able to engage in that inquiry about what's useful in the time. I also think that encouraging preparing. So in many cases we think of this kind of collective process as some people have a difficult time with it sometimes too, because it feels a little bit too unstructured, and you're not suggesting that we don't prepare. And I think that being able to prepare and being able to provide this space and create the space for people to work together and imagine the future is very much appreciated. People want to make sure that their time is invested wisely, that they're going to be able to move forward together. And sometimes bringing that professional expertise or that resource and skill, let's say as a leader or as an organizer, is something very useful in that case.
Right.
Would you have anything to add to that?
Well, only just to put a fine point on what you've already said, which is that, you know, sometimes the most collaborative thing we can do is be directive, which is ironic. But, you know, as you say, if the people you're working with say, just give us the answer, to the degree that you don't give the answer, you are being, you know, sort of command and control. No, we're going to do it my way, not your way. So a form of collaboration is to answer questions, is to make the decision yourself, if that's collaboratively what the group has decided upon. So there is this irony, you know, because we want to include everyone, but let's be, you know, honest here, that there are some contexts and some situations where including everybody means that they tell you they don't want to be included, and so and so how do you know how to respond to that? You can respond at that moment, but nothing is set in stone forever. And so because people, like, I'll just use the university kind of context, you know, we have dialogue, you know, seminars where everybody participates, and then some days the students just say, will you please just give a lecture and tell us what we need to know? And so, you know, then I do that. But if I were to do that every day, then they would say, this is too much. So nothing is all, it's that ability to be flexible, to move in and out of a variety of forms of being, and some forms that may emerge from collaborative coordination might be very hierarchical looking ways of acting, but they've emerged out of a collaborative process.
Right. Well, I've just looked at our time and we're at 10:30, and there are so many wonderful comments in the chat box. I wish I could take time to be fully engaged in the dialogue that's happening there between people. So I appreciate Saliani and Saliha, you continuing that conversation in the chat area, and we'll take a pause to connect there and just bring those comments back into the conversation too. But I thought we'd go through some of the illustrations of these principles. If everyone's okay with that, are you okay with that, Sheila?
Sure.
Okay, good. Oh, let's see, too many controls here. So I'm going to pull from what's most dear to me and closest to me in terms of some illustrations of where I see these aspects of relational leadership unfolding in a collective effort. I've been doing work in Chicago, which many of you may be familiar with. Chicago has about 3 million people, and we're working around the area of trauma-informed and restorative practices, and basing a lot of our work on the CDC Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, where if you apply some of that research, about 1 million people in Chicago are estimated to have experienced at least 2 significant adverse trauma-related experiences in childhood, which research is suggesting is one of the most powerful determinants of the public's health. So this is a very big priority in Chicago, with potential significant contributions to people's well-being. So we had Dr. Anda out from the CDC, and he was one of the principal investigators with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study with Vince Folletti at Kaiser, and he said something that struck me. He said, we don't have enough money or capacity to reach the number of people affected by adversity and trauma, that we need to embed the ability to heal within communities and have communities heal person to person. So to create that type of a collective response to healing within a community, a city of 3 million people, what might that take? So we're talking about increasing complexity, multiplicity, and diversity. And so I'd like to illustrate a couple of the ways that the community has been responding to build this level of response to adversity and trauma. There's a couple initiatives that I'll highlight. One is, many of you may be familiar with the art of hosting based upon some of the World Cafe and other dialogic and collective resources. The Art of Hosting Illinois has really been focusing on this adverse childhood experiences issue, and so practitioners, advocates, community organizers, educators, community members, leaders who are committed to sustaining healthy communities have come together so that children, youth, and families can thrive. And there's another initiative called Real Justice, which was just launched by the Woods Fund, which has a vision to build a metropolitan Chicago of communities, schools, governments, youth, and families who are working together to invest in youth development, reduce incarceration costs, and promote public safety, human rights, and stronger communities. And the City Department of Public Health has also just launched a planning process to develop a trauma-informed systems approach. So I'm going to use these different examples as illustrations of the different forms of practices. Here's a couple of the key folks who are near and dear to my heart. Marlena White's the director of the Office of Violence Prevention at the City Department of Public Health. Elena Quintana, the Institute of Public Safety and Social Justice at Adler School of Professional Psychology. Lena Kramer of Wisdom Exchange and Renee Jackson from the Next Generation of Leaders have really come together to take a look at how do we create spaces and conversations and processes that engage. So not only recognize complexity, multiplicity, and diversity, but engage in all of what's possible within this complexity, multiplicity, and diversity. So one of the things you were saying earlier, Sheila, that kind of struck me, you were talking about differences. So let me see, I wrote down a note here about spaces, you know, like often we try to come to consensus, which leaves out so many things that we're passionate about. And I think what this kind of collective effort has done is create spaces that holds all of what we're passionate about. And how do you do that so that it can move a whole system forward? One of the very concrete, specific examples of initiative, these are all parents who have lost children due to youth violence, and they were invited to share their stories in a circle process where people listened very deeply to their stories and then listened and harvested insights from their stories to inform what do families need who have lost children due to community violence. And it's an aspect of really engaging the diverse voices, inviting stories and honoring the wisdom that's within the stories. And so I wanted to share that as an example. As part of that process then with the harvesting of insights, we really engaged in reflexive inquiry, made connections between different stories, asked questions about what might be needed, what resources, what things need to shift within communities in order to better support families. I'm just going to pause for a moment before I go on to the next example. Is there anything that you wanted to share about any other resources or stories that connect with those, Sheila?
No, I'm fascinated just listening to this,
Okay.
your illustration. So yeah, please continue.
Okay, great. So, oh my goodness, I just blanked. I hate this when I do this blank on names. I cannot believe I just, Sophia Hall, Judge Sophia Hall and Peter Newman. Oh my goodness, sorry about that, guys. Anyway, our Judge Sophia Hall has been a huge advocate for restorative justice and re-looking at our juvenile justice system into looking at restorative justice and alternatives to youth incarceration. And Peter Newman has been her lead partner together, the two of them really working to bring people together. And they've engaged in using circle process to bring community leaders, community members, and youth together. And this question at one point was, how do we encourage all stakeholders to work together to create an environment where youth are an irresistible force for positive change? Talk about shifting to imagining a positive future. I just love this example, and you know, really shifts the traditional, or I should say the conventional methods that we might use within the justice system of saying, you know, this is the professional expertise and this is how we are going to move forward, to really engaging with curiosity and engaging multiple voices and stories about other ways that we might work together, and including youth in that voice. I think that's been a particularly important thing that Chicago is attempting to do, is including youth in this this inquiry. I love the element of prioritizing understanding and not agreement, and a lot of this shows up in the work that I've had the privilege of doing with intergenerational community building. And part of what I hear from youth so much when they talk about wanting to connect with adults and older adults and other generations is really having a better understanding of each other and connection. And I'll tell you what, there's not generally, there are generally some areas where there is not agreement. But there's a relational connection and prioritizing understanding and really caring and love for each other through inviting stories and also working side by side. I don't remember if that was on one of the resources, but somehow moving into action, I think maybe that's kind of imagining the future is moving into action. So taking steps towards that imagined future of working together and learning through that as well. And then just in every aspect, taking what we're learning, being able to represent that. I love having metaphors and artifacts and things that really can represent what people said. I think what's in these collective processes, if we're not capturing the voices and ways that people can see that they've been heard and that it's contributing to this imagined future, I think that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind as we engage in collective and collaborative practices. And then just to encourage preparing. And this fluidity, flexibility, I experience this when I'm teaching courses as well, that I realize my students want structure, they want direction, they want a roadmap. So the preparing is very important. But they also, I hope, appreciate the flexibility and the fluidity and being responsive to what's emerging in our conversations what's important to people in their learning, how they're applying that in their real, in their work experience. So I remind myself about this, about the importance of the preparing and in creating the structures and spaces and supports to help people, that really help people to be able to participate fully. So with that, did we want to, wanted to just do some illustrations as examples, and I know we have some others, and I can imagine there's some examples in our chat area. Should we take a moment to take a look at the chat area, Sheila, and I can see if there's some things that we can pull out for questions?
Sure. I don't have access to the chat area.
Okay,
so.
I'm going to look at it really quick. And maybe we could invite Saliani and Saliha on as well to reflect, because I think they've been involved in the conversations online.
Yes, thank you, Kristin. Siliani, if you don't mind coming online, I just want to take a minute to introduce Siliani to everyone. Siliani has been behind the scenes with me answering these chat questions as they were coming, and she's also part of the MS online programs faculty on relational leading. So Siliani, any question that stood out for you and as you were chatting?
Thank you, Saliha. Hello, everyone. Yes, there's some questions coming in, and one that's very interesting I would like to hear from Sheila and Kristin. How can we handle the fear of disagreement? So the participant says, I met a lot of people who are afraid to disagree. They're afraid of criticism, marginalization, and conflict. I think that's something that I always hear all the time. How can we manage that fear?
Yeah, that's a common question. It's a challenging question. I'm thinking right now I'm in the process of preparing a presentation to support a proposal I put in for a very large company to help them. What they want to do is make feedback and evaluation part of everyday conversations in the workplace. And it goes right to the heart of this because, we think about feedback and evaluation as happening like once every 6 months or once a year or whatever the routine is in a particular organization. And it always is negative, because people are telling you what you're not, there's disagreement around that. So I think the first step, and this is not easy, but is to change the culture slowly, to engage people in conversation about what it means to have a difference of opinion, to invite them into not judging immediately, but listening to the other stories. So again, I use this example a lot, but for those of you who are familiar with the Public Conversation Project, that's a very nice model for taking differences and allowing people to hear the difference and not judge the difference immediately. And so if you can build that kind of culture through small dialogic processes, over time, slowly I think a culture can emerge where difference doesn't have to be something that's shied away from, but it's actually something that's celebrated because it adds to and it enlivens an organization.
Mm-hmm.
I think, so if I could just add to that, we talk a lot about creating a safe enough space. So one of the resources was creating the space. And if we can create a safe enough space as well for people to be able to engage in disagreement and share when something, like, say, for example, someone said something that was maybe hurtful to another person, to be able to share that. Often in some work I've heard people say ouch and help understand, like being able to say, that was something that was painful for me to hear, and here's why, let me help you understand where I'm coming from. And I think that comes over time, and it also comes with certain resources of creating spaces that are safe enough to be able to trust that we can disagree and still move forward together.
And with that comment, I'm going to have to say that we have to go towards a wrap. Kristin, that's a great, actually, yeah, I know, it's like we just start warming up to these conversations and it's time to go for a wrap. But I think it's also a good way to set the stage for, I think one of the lead questions that's being asked in different ways is, how do you shift from a command and control organization, or how does the organization that's not used to these practices get introduced, or how do we create space for it? And I think it's part of what you started with, is that recognizing that it is in this multiplicities, that they're going to be the command and control and the collaborative practices in dialogue with each other. Mm-hmm. So any closing comments, Kristin and Sheila, before we shift?
Yeah, I would just like to say one thing about that, because that is huge, that, you know, you're in a command and control environment and you're trying to do something. So I'll just use very quickly the example of there could be nothing more command and control than a university, right? Mm-hmm. And so what as a metaphor, thinking about that, you recognize that I have chosen to be part of the university. I don't have, no one's forcing me to, okay? The students have chosen to be part of the university. So if you have that conversation, say, look, we have chosen to be part of this, and here are the things that we need to do because of the command and control. Like, I need to grade, students need to get grades, all that kind of stuff. Now that we accept that, how can we do that in a way that is more collaborative and participatory and engaging amongst us? So you can mix things up. You can play with how you meet those command and control requirements. And just as one example, you know, I say to my students, I have to give you a grade, but no grade is ever final till you say it's final. So if you want to rewrite your paper like 100 times, you can rewrite your paper 100 times. And wherever we end the conversation, that's the grade you'll get. So they have more of a say in how that plays out. So that's just my closing comment.
Thank you, Sheila. Kristin?
No, it's just a pleasure to have been here, and I so appreciate the chat dialogue that was going on. I can't wait to go in and hear more of the stories and questions and continue the conversation. I did want to share that I'll come back to this slide. Here that we really do encourage people to continue the conversation. We created a Google document. I've created a little tiny URL here, so tinyurl.com / or / I can never remember what that is, relational leading, for people to share stories, questions, and like striking moments from this conversation and the ongoing conversation about relational leading and collaborative practice. And then we also encourage people to tweet with a hashtag relational leading if you tweet. So I'm really grateful for, of course, the conversation with Sheila. I continue to just learn so much being in conversation with you, and the conversation that was happening on chat. I appreciate everyone's contributions.
Yes, thank you both, Sheila and Kristin, and for everyone's questions and participation. And thank you, Celiani, for continuing to engage online. It's always a challenge, and to have a partner in crime there to take those questions together, it's really a pleasure. So thank you for that. And I just wanted to share again, reinforce what Kristin said. Please continue the dialogue. We will be having more seminars and webinars coming along, which is being sponsored by the program, the online program, Master's Program in Relational Leading. And if you want to learn more about this, if you want to learn and engage the faculty members that we've been talking about in the past webinars and these ideas, please consider this 2-year program, which is a degree program granted by the Middlesex University in London. And it's very practitioner focused and definitely gives credit for work experience. And our application deadline for the fall semester is coming up on July 6th. I think it's the next, it's on the slide. And if you want information about the program itself, please contact our program director, Jeannie Belden-Charles, and her email is on the bottom of the slide, please. And you can also go to relational-leading.net to get more information and contact us there as well. There's a form, inquiry form, and the link is on this slide, and you can get more information. So we look forward to hearing from you and look forward to having you join us at the next webinar, the free webinar that's coming up. is going to be really exciting. It's going to be on improvisational dialogue about appreciative inquiry and relational leading. And in dialogue will be Diana Whitney and Frank Barrett. And if you've not heard these speakers, please join us. It'll be a treat. And if you have heard them, you know it's going to be great. And with that, let's continue the conversation online. Is there anything else before I close? Don't want to be missing out anything.
No, thank you. Thank you, Saliha and Saliani, Kristin. Great to be in conversation with you. And thanks for all those listening in.
Well, thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you online or at the next seminar. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.